Hi everyone, my name is falk Morawitz, and some of you may know me if you've been here, say 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I've finished my PhD here in kind of a related area in electroacoustic music composition, and now I work as a lecturer at futureworks, which is a university in Salford. So I'm doing a lot of stuff in terms of game engines, interactive audio, game audio, and things like that. So it kind of informs my current practice as well. And so what this talk today is really kind of it says here, an exploration of game features. So we mostly, it's kind of a very basic introduction into two things mostly. One is to introduce game features. What are like game design features? How can we use them? And the second is to have a look at a thing called Unreal Engine, which is a game engine where we can take those game features and turn them into a composition. So I know that some of you who've done their bachelor's here had to do a course on Unreal Engine, which I actually taught many years ago. So I definitely know that some people are struggling, some people it comes very naturally. But this talk is really just about inspiring you and seeing, where could you take this idea of game features, even beyond, say, game engines. And so when I talk about gamification, gamification is basically everything that involves the use of game design elements in non-game contexts. And that could be basically anywhere. And it has been picked up over the last 10 years, mostly in business settings where you gamify a certain task. And so your employers, your employees basically work that task more efficiently, or they might have more fun doing certain things. And we can also see it in lots of game shows as the what is it called, Project Runway, or things where actually a process that used to be very limited, say we need a new designer for a new fashion line, now becomes a big game where people have contests, where people do certain things to progress, and then this can be shown to an audience, and so it becomes a whole more of a spectacle if you want. And so I'm looking at things on how to use gamification in music composition, and it really is, as I say, it's coming from a business point of view, where in business there's actually already this idea that, we have defined certain game features that we find it works really well for business, such as a narrative context, teams, time pressure, marketplace economies, like explicit and enforced rules. But we don't really, at least to my knowledge, there's no such coherence in music and art at this point where we say, well, if you use game features, use this feature, use it like this will be really interesting. Mostly, of course, because business is more streamlined towards a singular purpose, whereas art has a few more kind of avenues in how to develop. But it's still something that we might keep in mind, that maybe in a few years' time, we actually can come up with a certain set of rules, a certain set of guidelines that might be interesting in this regard. So these are just a couple of examples of game design elements. There are many more, but these are, as I said, defined in businesses that kind of work well for like engaging people, such as reputation ranks, self-representation, and as avatars. And what we kind of see is that some of these ideas we already incorporate in our compositions, either explicitly or implicitly. Here we can see one of Ricardo's pieces where we already see avatars on screen. We can see a sort of interplay between the machine. There's a narrative, so we see a lot of game elements happening. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can only have game elements if you use a game engine. We can think about aleatoric pieces. John Cage, or even Mozart Würfelspiel, these kind of like rule-based systems are kind of very close to kind of a game-based system. And so what I want to talk about real quick is, why do we actually use these kind of systems anyway? And I think there's 4 kind of main points of using these, and my focus will be on one particular today, but there's 4 main focuses, which is one for the composer. The composer now has a new kind of framework in which he doesn't necessarily compose a music via a written notation, but he actually has to compose a certain set of game rules. And through these game rules, then there will be a certain type of interaction, a certain type of music that evolves from these rules. So it's a kind of a ludic type of composition where we basically, instead of having a top-down approach of saying this is our structure, this is the main purpose of our piece, it's becoming a bottom-up compositional approach where we define certain small elements, and then the interplay of these elements will give us our music music piece. So that's kind of interesting when it comes to composer. For a performer, which is the second focus for game engines that is interesting for a performer, then this kind of interplay becomes different from just playing music from a piece of paper and having a computer as some sort of sound transformational device. The computer actually becomes a entire different entity, like a partner using, say, artificial intelligence, machine learning. These kind of responses are more, I wouldn't say random, but they're more almost human in a way, more unpredictable. And so the performer can either, can use these kind of interactions to inform how they play, how they interact with the music composition. The third aspect is the audience itself. We're kind of exposed to games in our daily lives. So this kind of metaphor of winning a game using like getting higher and higher scores. These metaphors can be also used in music to give the audience a sense of the progression of the music itself. So if they, if they're not experts in the field of electroacoustic music composition, there are still shared metaphors in gaming that can be used to maybe convey a sense of what the piece is all about. So it's a sense of if the audience understands your music better, then maybe the aesthetic experience change. And so there's a lot of interesting things here that we, as music composers, have not really explored. The last thing is technology. And this is probably my focus for the talk today, is that actually there's a lot of unused technology or unused features of game engines that we have not really explored. So I want to go a bit into more detail about this, but I definitely want you, if you're interested, also think about all the other aspects that are, basically in their infancy, in a way, using in music composition. So there is a group around Marco Siciliani and Barbara Luneberg who actually have started using game compositions and presenting these in a very structured fashion, where they show them to an audience and then ask the audience like a standardized questionnaire about how do they think about the piece, how do they identify game elements within those works. And well, you probably can't read it because the text is so small. So they basically have 7 music pieces and ask them, do you think, what reminds you most of games in these music pieces? Is it, the roles of the performer? Is it the interface itself that you see? Is it action-reaction? Is it the involvement or interaction between the performer and the visuals? Is it the narrative? Is it the structure? Is it the progress, the goals, or the rules of the game engine? And what we can actually see here is that for most of these different aspects of game design features, only the interaction between the performer and the game engine reminds people of games itself. So this is kind of a very interesting point, because what it actually means is that we can use game features without explicitly reminding the audience of games. So that could be something really freeing for the music composer, not to involve any kind of extraneous references, because, as I say, references can change the aesthetic experience of the audience. So we can actually keep it free of game references, or we can actually explicitly enforce game references, focusing on a very, particular metaphor of, involving the audience with, or involving the performer and how the performer interacts with the game engine. So today, I just put a couple of things down that I think is actually really interesting to explore in music composition that are game design elements, such as a questing structure, enemies, or and some sort of NPCs, avatars, resources, high scores, inventories, conflicts, puzzles, and we've actually already seen a lot of, or some of these being explored either through just coming natural using game engines, such as using an inventory, which reminds me, when I actually started my master's about, maybe 5-6 years ago, one of the first pieces I saw was Ricardo's piece using the, actually Ricardo's and Mark piece, combining the VCS3 with the Putney synthesizer, the virtual Putney synthesizer, where actually the individual parts had to be collected, which already is a system of inventory being used, a long time ago. What I want to focus on today is actually three other kind of things that I think are really much unexplored or underexplored in a way, which is first virtual environments, then artificial intelligence or like enemy design, and the last one are a quest design in music composition. So here, if this works out really fast, I have a couple of media that I just want to show you. And the first of them is a music piece that I had. Oops. Is this the button? Yeah. A music piece that I have composed a long time ago. So basically, in this piece, the idea was to explore the space of this kind of environment, this virtual environment, using a very sparse visual metaphor, but actually have people guided through sound through these kind of virtual environments. So the person in charge, or the person who wanted to experience this, would have to pick up a headset and then reach out to kind of interact with whatever is in the virtual environment. And we can see here actually, we still had to use a headset and like an additional leap motion to pick up hands, whereas nowadays, as I actually just learned today, like Chris said, the newest version of the Oculus has actually already these stereoscopic monitors inbuilt, so these kind of hand gestures become more natural. So things that we actually had to do kind of sort of roundabout, hacky kind of ways of interacting now become more and more natural. So the idea was you can actually reach out into this virtual space, you can interact with these molecules, in this case molecular representations, and you would hear how these molecular representations then would sound over time. And the structure was actually divided in 3 spaces. One was some sort of tutorial space, again using a kind of a game term, where people had to interact with a certain amount of molecules, touch them, and then after they have understood this metaphor, they could then use this metaphor to kind of go into the more free roam mode, where the molecules would swirl all around them and they had a more kind of holistic experience of this virtual environment. So here's a short example of like the tutorial stage, which is much like more sparse in music, but kind of uses a quest design to kind of get people going into what they need to do. So we can here see a task. And through this kind of like task structure, the audience, even without my presence, could then start interacting with the space itself. And so going kind of through this, I really found that this kind of use of space is quite interesting. A virtual space in this case is quite interesting as a compositional parameter, because it can you can put sounds in space. But for molecules, you could actually think of molecules as having different atoms, but each atom would be a separate speaker in a way. So you could have every molecule in space would be their own specialized music composition that then people could move from one to the other. And depending on how big the molecule was, they would have a certain type of like strong surround sound. And actually, let me just play the last little piece of video here, so I can stay within the PDF. So what we can see here is like every single of these molecules then plays a different sound. And if we are in the headset in binaural audio, we can then hear all of these sounds coming around us, giving us a kind of a much more intimate experience of space and spatial composition than I think we could do, for example, in stereo. And what is interesting about this in game engines as well is that they natively support multi-channel formats, mostly the commercial ones such as 5.1 and 7.1, but also 7.4.1 with 4 speakers on the ceiling. And so we can actually have multi-channel compositions based on these kind of virtual spaces as well. So while this is good, I think actually game engines can do a lot more. And what game engines can do really well is actually having an awareness of how objects and space relate to one another. So this is kind of, now we're going kind of into these more exploratory experiences or exploratory experiments that I've done, where we can actually use the game engine itself and all the technology that is in the game engine to make every sphere, which could be a speaker or like a source of sound, we make it aware of all its other environments and then change the musical response depending on what's happening in those environments. And in Unreal Engine, because it's a visual-based coding environment, there is tons of like pre-made code that will help you to kind of figure out how different objects are relating to one another. So this is something here where I explored line of sight, do objects see each other, or how many objects are in a certain radius. And you can actually then define fitness functions that say, try to capture as many other spheres in your surrounding as possible while trying to minimize your own kind of effective radius. And so these kind of like fitness functions then become a source of a process that then can be used for music composition that then ideally becomes a very complex music composition, because if every sphere follows very simple rules, they're a combined kind of musical output might become something very, very complicated. And so Unreal Engine is actually not even stopping there, because there's another system there called an EQS, an environmental query system, which I've kind of tested here, where you can define, again, different functions on how an actor in this virtual space sees its surrounding in terms of like danger and like safety. So in this case here, I said, what you can see is safe, but what you can't see is not safe. So it kind of has this grid that it's always aware of its surrounding, even though there's maybe no other actors present. So all of these kind of things are really, really interesting. And I don't think at least not the EQS has never been used in a music composition. So there's definitely things there where I think space, yeah, but actually look at all these interesting things that we can do in space. And then, of course, because these are all systems, we can frame them however we like. So you could put them, in any kind of environment. In this case, I made like my own procedural forest where I put these systems in a space that people could, surround themselves with and then enjoy these kind of like environmental systems. There's two more things I want to talk about, and I want to keep it a bit short. So here I'm just going to talk about how we can use AI. And for this, I actually talked to a couple of game programmers at White Paper Studios, and I asked them, how do you make a good enemy AI? And they basically said, well, it needs to be believable and mostly predictable. So the example they gave me is, if you have a stealth game and you try to stealth around, you get caught by a guard. If the guard is alone, he might run away to find help in fighting you. But if there's two or more, they might start just taking their guns and shooting you. And this kind of thing would happen predictably, that you could say, well, if it's a lonely guard, he probably runs away. If it's more than one, there probably will be a firefight. So, but their actions are also, in a sense, believable. And one of the key components here that is interesting is that if it's a new action, it should hopefully be telegraphed to the player. So instead of shooting the player right away, he might try to unholster his gun, which gives the player the idea, okay, something's going to happen with that gun. And this kind of idea of telegraphing might be something really interesting in music, whereas a game engine where we can define certain ways of telegraphing our action to the performer, the performer then will start understanding what the game engine is about to do. We actually already know about this when we have two performers at the same time. They will look at each other and have their cue to play at the same time. These kind of things, we can quite easily expand to the kind of the game engine realm using these kind of telegraphing ideas here. And again, Unreal Engine already has a system in place for designing all of these kind of things, which is the behavioral tree, something that is not a blueprint, but something very similar to it, where we can just say, hey, check for certain conditions, and if certain conditions are met, try to do these kind of tasks, and if other conditions are met, try something else. So it already has a complete system there that is ready-made for these kind of enemy designs, and therefore also for designing custom actors that can help or like interplay with musical performers. The last little thing that I want to talk about is good quest design, and here what the programmers at white paper or game set is that a quest needs to be clear, and it can't overburden the player and scale in difficulty over time. And again, I think this is quite interesting when we think about the audience itself. So the performer probably doesn't matter if he practices a piece. Eventually, he doesn't need like easy parts. But for the audience trying to understand a certain piece, again, we can think about it as, the first minute of a piece could be a tutorial showing how the player or the performer interacts with the musical piece. And through this understanding, the audience then will hopefully have a bigger appreciation of the piece itself. So these ideas of, scaling the music in a way might be quite interesting. The most important slide, however, is the last one, where these kind of game programmers have introduced to me the concept of flow, where flow is being defined as the mental state of a player when the physical input perfectly matches with their expected outcomes. So you might know about this when you play games and you're really into that game. This kind of boundary between the physical space, you holding the controller, and the virtual space kind of gets diminished, and you become part of the game, where everything you do will translate exactly to what you expect happens in that game. And so I think actually this idea of flow is something we can aspire to in music composition. Breaking down this boundary between the virtual and the real. So if we start having interfaces, maybe the Mayo hand measurements device or other kind of devices that when we use our gestures or when we even play musical instruments, kind of how we interpret this in a computer, if this matches exactly our expectation, then we will become we will enter this part of this state of flow. And so therefore, this kind of boundary between what we do and the virtual world will become kind of obsolete. And that's kind of what I want to get at. And this point is, this is kind of the idea for me in game engines, where I think we will probably have a lot of interesting research coming out, in the next couple of years, is completely annihilating this kind of boundary between the virtual and the real, because it doesn't really need to be a boundary. And therefore, if we carefully design these kind of interactions, we can probably get to a point where we don't have to talk about game engines anymore, where it just becomes another part of composition. But as you will see, there's still a long way to go. To go from something, I think we're pretty much at this point here in game composition. We're at this point where we have all the elements of a game in a music composition, but to go to something that I think really encapsulates game elements that are possible in games and really get them over to music composition, we still have a long way to go. That's my talk. So I'm pretty happy to have an open round discussion and kind of just talk in general about game engines or ideas, brainstorming ideas, how to get these things in and out. And as I said, you don't have to use game engines, but if you're just aware of game design elements, these might help making quite interesting music compositions along the way. So yeah, thank you for your attention.
Any questions? Any thoughts?
I like the last slide about the flow. You do get into the same as you're playing a piece of music. There's a certain point of departure from yourself where you start to play. It's the same way you're playing space and things. So you get to a point where your brain is and your physicality is you don't need to think yourself connected to the game.
Yes.
But looking at those slides, I don't. The physical input is obviously still through a controller, isn't it?
Yeah.
And people are researching sort of haptic sort of devices.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, where do you think it's going to go? I mean,
Yeah.
you touched on points that are already sort of within the gamification.
I think the biggest part is what we can learn from HCI, from human-computer interactions. And so these kind of like, it can go two ways really for me. One would be to really think about human gestures in a way and give them virtual metaphors. So if I make a certain gesture in a virtual space like this, then it could mean one thing. But if you give me a virtual object in that space, like a bow and an arrow, then this gesture becomes something very different, right? Then I know that I have to aim somewhere. If I just do this without any virtual assistance, then it would be a completely different metaphor. So maybe we can find the right virtual metaphors so our gestures become meaningful to ourselves, but also meaningful to the game. So that would be one way. Another way would be, there already exists, I think, a state of flow, as you say, for music performers performing their instruments virtuously. could we actually expand on this? Could we analyze music streams more succinctly so that we can turn these musical streams into action that happen in the game world as well? So we could say, play an arpeggio, and then this arpeggio might change something that happens in the game world. But the most important part is that it needs to be understandable how your actions, change the world itself. So that might be, again, another divide. Why would playing, a certain scale? Why would that interact differently than another? So, but I can see it going either way. And as I said, there's much to be done there. So we'll see what happens. Cool. So yeah, if there's no more questions, then thanks for coming to my TED Talk, and I'll see you all next time.